Thank you all for coming. I know it's a really busy weekend, and it's been my privilege to learn about the Chinese dance scene here in Singapore and to see some of the performances, which I absolutely enjoyed this weekend. I saw both of the Elements dance performance on Friday and then also today. And I'm inspired to see that there's such a vibrant Chinese dance scene going on here. Really what I'm talking about today is a new book that I published just a few months ago. It's called Revolutionary Bodies, Chinese Dance and the Socialist Legacy. And this is actually the first book published in English that gives a detailed history of Chinese dance for the English language academic sphere, for dance lovers in English parts of the world, in English-speaking parts of the world, and then also for students and scholars to learn about the history of Chinese dance. And one of the exciting things about this book is that I was able to get a grant to publish it open access. So that means that anyone, anywhere in the world can download the entire book for free as a digital ebook PDF. So if you're interested, the website is here where you can download the book. You can also buy hard copies of the book as well if you're interested. And one of the also things that's really great about the book being an ebook is that there's actually videos embedded in the ebook. So when people are reading about these different dances, in many cases they'll be able to click on the video inside the book and actually watch short clips of the videos. And so I'll be showing some of those clips in my talk today, but of course I'll only be able to show really short sections and I won't be able to show all of them. So if you're interested in seeing more, I encourage you to just go find the book online and you can see the video clips there as well. So no matter where I'm talking about my research, I feel like it's really important to start out with the question of what is Chinese dance? Many people have very different understandings of what this term means. So in some contexts, when I say that I study Chinese dance, people think that maybe I'm doing research on ancient dance forms from like the Tang Dynasty, because that's what people think of when they think of Chinese dance. In other cases, some people think that I'm actually working on guangchang wu, or sort of more like popular dance forms that are practiced by people of all ages, oftentimes in public parks, because that's something that many people who are not necessarily professionals in the Chinese dance world, that's sometimes the only thing that they've seen. Also, especially when I speak to foreigners from outside China, oftentimes their only encounters with Chinese dance maybe through like tourism events. So if they go to a tourist site in China, or even sometimes if they visit tourist sites in other parts of the world that are trying to represent Chinese culture through dance, they'll see some kinds of dance performances. But one thing I really want to emphasize is that I'm actually not researching any of those phenomena, even though they're all very important, and in some ways they are connected to the history that I'll be talking about today. But actually what I'm writing about in this book is professional Chinese dance, or a dance that's studied in the context of a concert dance academy, so like dance conservatories, and also especially dance that's created for the concert stage. So it's meant to be a type of fine art, and it's meant to be performed in a stage setting. And so I want to give you some visual and kinesthetic ideas of what this dance form looks like today in China, which is the primary focus of what I write about in the book, is Chinese dance in China, even though of course we know that Chinese dance is also being practiced all over the world now. So first I'll just show 4 short clips from different professional dance academies in China that I visited in the past few years. And Elizabeth said she thought it would be nice if I gave you a bit more context about these videos, since most of you are practitioners of Chinese dance. You might be interested in some of these details. So this video was a video I took just a few months ago at the Beijing Dance Academy, and it's actually an experimental class that Professor Li Xin, who's a professor in the Chinese classical dance department, is doing. She's thinking of creating a new curriculum on the basis of the Shenyuan curriculum to add new props, and so one of the props that she's thinking of adding is this one. And so this was just an experiment that she did with some students in the Zhongzhuan in the middle school. But I think this video does a pretty good job of just showing in general the Shenyuan aesthetic of Chinese classical dance, which is a very important one within the broader Chinese dance field. one style of Chinese dance. I'll show you another example. So this is a film I took in a year and a half ago in Xinjiang, and it's students from the Xinjiang Art Academy. And this was actually part of another really interesting experimental project that's going on. It's 4 ethnic minority regions of China that are participating. The Yanji Arts Academy, Neimenggu Arts Academy, the Middle Inner Mongolia Arts Academy. The first one I mentioned, Yanji, is a predominantly ethnic Korean community. So it's ethnic Korean, ethnic Mongolian, ethnic Central Asian, so Xinjiang, Kazakh, and other ethnic groups in the Northwest, which are represented here. And then the last school that's participating is a school in Tibet. And so it's 4 different ethnic minority predominated communities that are actually working together to think of ways in which they can create their own basic training program so that they don't have to use Chinese classical dance to train their dancers, but they can actually use their own training methods from the basic training curriculum all the way up to the advanced level. And so this is just one example of a Xinjiang dance performance that the students were performing, and it's not in a classroom setting, it's in a stage setting, but it's still based on classroom movements. And so I intentionally chose videos here that are non-narrative. They're just focusing on the form of the movement itself. And that's because one of the things that I think is really crucial for us to understand is that Chinese dance is a set of movement forms. It's a set of movement vocabularies that are distinct, that are different from other dance styles. And that creation of that movement vocabulary is at the heart of the creative process for Chinese dance and Chinese dance history. And these movement vocabularies are extremely diverse, so you can instantly see that this is very different from the one I showed earlier. There's no one single movement vocabulary that represents Chinese dance. Rather, there's many different movement vocabularies that all fall under the umbrella of Chinese dance. The next video that I'll be showing is from the Inner Mongolian Arts Academy, and I like this video because it gives you a sense of the musical accompaniment that often appears in the studio. And so there's a close connection between Chinese dance and national music, or 民族乐队, 民族音乐. And interestingly, this part of the reason that I visited that school in 2012 is that they were actually teaching for the first time their new Inner Mongolian-based Jixuan basics training curriculum. And that's not what this class was, but it was happening at the school. You can get a sense of what they're doing. So again, you can see it's a totally different movement aesthetic. And again, this falls under the broader category of Chinese dance. And this is, they're exercising a specific technical movement within this Inner Mongolian male curriculum. Okay, and then this is the last example I'll show. This is an example from Northeast China in the Jilin Arts Academy in Changchun, and this shows an example of the Han ethnic majority folk dance from that region, as performed in the conservatory setting. So some people have the misconception that within Chinese dance, there's Chinese classical dance, and then there's Chinese ethnic minority dance, and some people think that folk dance is only ethnic minority dance. But in fact, Chinese dance includes a large number of dance styles that represent folk forms of different regional Han majority ethnic groups. So there's Han folk dance too, not just ethnic minority folk dance within the curriculum. And again, you can hear that the music is also drawing on regional musical folk melodies as well, and instrumentation. as well as the props that are being used. So in this case, the handkerchiefs are being drawn from folk performance styles practiced in the Dongbei region. Okay, so with that in mind, there are a couple major points that I think are important to emphasize in the way that I understand Chinese dance as an art form. So the first thing is Chinese dance has many names. So it used to be called 中国舞蹈 in mainland China. Now the term 中国舞 is more commonly used. So I would say in China today, 中国舞 is probably the most common term that people will use to describe this entire dance form. In Taiwan, the word 民族舞蹈 is the standard term, but if you use that term in China, people will also understand what it means. Although sometimes 民族舞蹈, people use it especially to refer to ethnic minority dance. But historically, the word 民族舞蹈 also referred to Chinese dance in many contexts. It just means national dance or ethnic dance. And so in the Chinese context, that means Chinese dance. And then of course we know that here in Southeast Asia, the term 华族舞蹈 is a term that's used here. This just reflects different ways that Chinese ethnic communities identify themselves. And so as I understand it, 华族舞蹈 also refers to 中国舞, also refers to 民族舞蹈. So these are all basically describing the same dance form, and that's really what I'm writing about here. One thing that I really want to emphasize is that this is a contemporary, creative, conservatory dance practice. And this is important, especially when we're talking about Chinese dance in the English language, because in the English language, unfortunately, we don't have very good terminology for describing Chinese dance. So people will sometimes use the word folk dance to describe Chinese dance, but in the English language context, folk dance usually is used outside the conservatory setting, and usually it's not associated with creative artistic practice. But Chinese dance is a type of folk dance that's specifically for the conservatory setting and for creative practice, and so I want to emphasize that. Also, the term classical dance can sometimes conjure up ideas of tradition or of a dance form that's sort of not changing. Or a dance form even that shouldn't change. Some people, when they talk about classical art forms, they think, oh, that's something that needs to stay fixed in place. But in fact, if we look at Chinese dance history, when the term Chinese classical dance was developed and the approach to creating Chinese classical dance was first created, it was actually meant to be an artistic practice that encouraged creativity and individual research and interpretation. This is the first thing that I really, really always emphasize when explaining Chinese dance, is that from the beginning, it is a contemporary form that's meant to express contemporary people's cultural experiences and identities and creative aspirations. And it's a form that's constantly changing. So you could see even from the videos that I showed, in 2018, there are people experimenting with new ways of teaching Chinese classical dance at the Beijing Dance Academy, which is considered to be sort of the center of Chinese dance practice. So even at the Beijing Dance Academy, they're not happy with what they have. They want to continue to create, and they want to continue to create new possibilities for expression in this form. So it's not static. The second point that's very important is, as I already mentioned, Chinese dance includes many different styles. So Chinese classical dance, 中国古典舞, Han folk dance, 汉族民间舞, ethnic minority dance, 少数民族舞蹈. These are all included within Chinese dance. And these are forms that one quality that they all share, even though they're quite different, they're all created through research into local cultural materials. So they're all created through inspiration from local theater practices, such as various types of 地方戏, or Jingju or Kunshu in the case of Chinese classical dance. They're also inspired by ritual performances that are sometimes performed in the context of like New Year celebrations or harvest festivals or religious rituals. Or they're performed in the context of various types of ethnic minority holiday celebrations, wedding dances. Basically, any kind of performance practice that exists in China can be seen as a potential source of inspiration for these dance forms. And so that's one of the things that they all have in common, is that they're all created through some sort of inspiration coming from local materials. And then the last point that I think is really important to make is that Chinese dance is practiced all over China today. It's also practiced in many Chinese diasporic and Sinophone communities, places like Singapore, Malaysia. In the United States, we have many active Chinese dance companies, also in Canada, Australia, and other places around the world. Pretty much wherever there's people of Chinese ethnicity, you have people doing Chinese dance. So in 2016, the Chinese National Academy of Arts, the 中国艺术研究院, published a report sort of cataloging all the different official concert dance productions that were staged in China that year. And this included productions by both domestic Chinese ensembles and ensembles coming from elsewhere around the world. And based on their statistics, they found that of this total set of dances, over half that were being staged in concert settings in China were actually performed in the style of Chinese dance, compared to 28% in the style of ballet and 16% in the style of modern or contemporary dance. And so concert dance choreography of Chinese dance is an extremely rich and diverse and multitudinous practice. You have hundreds of new dances being created every year across the world in the Chinese dance styles and being put on stage. And I think this is especially important as a motivation for me for thinking about why I wanted to write a book in English about Chinese dance. And that's because previously, scholars who are writing in the English language about dance in China have tended to have a really clear bias towards writing about dance styles that come from the West. So this is just an example of some of the most prominent books in English about dance in the Chinese-speaking world. And this one is about Yangbanxi, so it includes ballet. This is a book about American modern dance in East Asia, 现代舞. This is also a book about Yangbanxi that includes writing about ballet. This is a book about Wutingwu in Shanghai in the 1930s and 40s, and this is a book about contemporary dance companies like Yunmen Wuji, Taiwan's Cloud Gate Dance Company, the City Contemporary Dance Company of Hong Kong, and a modern dance company created by Chinese Americans. And so one of the patterns that you see in all of these books is they're all focusing on Western dance forms, or dance forms that sort of originated in the West that are being practiced in China. And so this is sort of the existing scholarly understanding of dance practice in China. And from my perspective, although it's excellent scholarship, it's really missing a key component, which is English language writing about Chinese dance. And given what I just said about the fact that over half of the dances being performed in China are in the style of Chinese dance, this is a dance style that if we want to understand dance in China, we definitely need to understand. And so this is what really motivated me to want to write a book about Chinese dance, is to change the perception of what's happening in China so that people outside China know that it's not only Western dance styles that are being practiced. So in order to write this book, I actually started out like, I didn't know anything about Chinese dance growing up in the United States either. But the way that I learned about Chinese dance and the way that I fell in love with Chinese dance and decided to study Chinese dance for my life's work was actually through the generosity of my teachers at the Beijing Dance Academy. So I was very fortunate to have a scholarship from the United States government that allowed me to spend a year and a half at the Beijing Dance Academy studying Chinese dance forms. And as a dance scholar, I believe that embodied knowledge is a very important part of the scholarly research process. So the first step for me to conduct research on Chinese dance was actually to use my body as a tool of research. And it wasn't always easy. It was actually very, 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 very challenging, even though I had a dance background. I previously, as a child, studied ballet, and I also was a very serious competitive ballroom dancer for about 10 years. But all of those dance styles are totally different from Chinese dance, and so it was like starting over studying Chinese dance in that context. But it was through that really challenging process that I gained an appreciation for the form from the inside out, and I also learned to really understand Chinese dance from a practitioner's perspective. The next step for me in reaching a better understanding of Chinese dance was conducting oral history interviews with leading practitioners of Chinese dance in the field. So I interviewed initially about 150 different dancers, and now at this point I've collected about 200 oral histories of professional dancers from all ages, from all across China. The one thing they have in common is that they all make their living through dance in some way. And the ones I've selected to show here are people who have had an exceptionally important influence on the dance form. So the person down here was a long-time administrator for the Dongfang Gou Tuan, the Oriental Song and Dance Ensemble. So he told me from an administrator's perspective about the history of that ensemble. The woman on the top, Sichin Tara Ha, is one of the first very influential practitioners of ethnic Mongolian dance, and she herself is ethnic Mongolian ethnicity. She was in her 80s when I conducted this interview in her home. And then the other one on the far right is Sheng Jie, and she was in her 90s actually when I conducted this interview. She actually just passed away at the age of 99, I believe, or 98 a few years ago. But she was the wife of Wu Xiaobang, who's considered to be like the father of modern dance in China, and she herself actually played quite an important role in the early creation of Chinese dance. So for me, this was actually a very, very powerful experience, hearing the life histories of each of these individual dancers. Because in many cases, they actually showed me whole windows into different local experiences in Chinese history that I would have never known, even from reading books on Chinese dance, because many of their individual stories haven't been documented fully. The other component that was a very important part of the research process for me was just watching as much Chinese dance as possible. So I think we all know that if you really want to understand what's happening in dance, you have to go to see as many performances as you can. You can't rely on the few performances that are put on television or made into DVDs, because it's just such a small percentage. And oftentimes it's sort of the most interesting ones that never really find their way into the historical record of filmmaking. So just going to the concert, all different theaters all over China, that was a huge part of my research. And the other thing that was really interesting for me was not only to watch what was being performed on stage, but also to see who was in the audience. So there are different audiences, even within the style of Chinese dance. You have different audiences who go to see Yang Liping, for example, versus the audiences in Xinjiang that are seeing this performance, right? Or the audiences that go to see Da Xin Wu Ju. These are all, a large-scale Chinese dance drama. These are all very specific audiences, and you can tell a lot about the piece by just seeing who's there, also seeing where it's being performed, which theater is it being performed in, which cities is it being performed in, what's the ticket price? Are people buying tickets, or are they getting tickets through their networks of connections, right? All of that makes a difference in terms of what the dance culture is that dance is coming from. And so that was a very formative part of my research process as well. One of the things that was particularly interesting to me was when I was in Beijing, I would go to see all the performances. The modern dance performances and the ballet performances always had bilingual programs, and there were always a lot of foreigners in the audience. The Chinese dance performances almost very rarely had bilingual programs. The programs were in Chinese, the audiences were almost completely in Chinese, and if you look at how they were being advertised, they were being advertised more for local Chinese audiences. And that told me something very important about how popular Chinese dance was in China, but it also helped me to understand why previous scholars working outside China, working in English language material, might be blinded to the existence and the importance of Chinese dance, because maybe they just never heard about it, they never had an opportunity to see it being performed. So as I'm sure you all know, there's actually a really extensive and wonderfully rich academic scholarly field happening in Chinese language, of Chinese language writing about Chinese dance. So this is just a couple photographs that I took at home on my personal library. I've been collecting books on Chinese dance over the years. And so all of these books do a really excellent job of telling about the history of Chinese dance from different perspectives. So for example, this is a whole book documenting the history of Chinese dance drama. This is a book specifically about the first professional dance class that happened at the Central Academy of Drama in 1951 to 52. This whole book is just sort of about that one class. This is a book about dance history in the People's Liberation Army. And so this is a dance history of the most famous PLA dance company, right? This is an individual's own dance memory. So all of these books, if you sort of put them together, you can get a picture of the sort of broader history of Chinese dance. But one of the things for me that I found sort of missing when I read a lot of these books is that a lot of the scholars, because they were writing from their own personal knowledge, or because of the way that they were conducting research, they didn't necessarily document the original sources that they looked at. So it was very hard from reading these books to understand what were the primary sources that were actually giving them the knowledge that they were writing about it. And so for me, I decided that if I wanted to write my own history of Chinese dance, it wouldn't really be, from a scholarly perspective, it wouldn't be enough to sort of combine all these books together. What I really wanted to do and what I felt was necessary was to go back to the original sources and create my own narrative and sort of make sense of them on my own based on the original sources that I could find. And so what I did was, first I started collecting dance films. Because as we know, reading about dance is not the same as being able to watch a video of dance. And one of the things that I found that I was actually surprised by, but also really excited by, was the fact that there is actually a large number of dance films made in China, but dating back to the late 1940s. So there's a couple dance films from the 1940s that I use in the book. This is one example of Diana in 1947. There's many, actually, I think I ultimately found 8 or 9 dance films just made in the 1950s alone. The 1960s also was a very prodigious period for Chinese dance films, and then in the 80s you get even more and more. So dance films ended up being a really important source for me to understand the history of Chinese dance. Apart from that, there's a wide array. Fortunately, the Chinese government has invested a lot in documenting Chinese dance from various directions. So there are dance magazines like Wu Dao. There are dance publications that are very specialized that are actually intended for other dancers. And so this is an example here, Wu Dao Xuexi Ziliao, resources for studying dance. And these are internal publications that dancers create for one another. There's also a huge amount of dance criticism published in mainstream newspapers like the People's Daily. And then of course there's actually a large number of individual dancer autobiographies that are now being published. And so these are some of the published sources that I used. And then lastly, I did a lot of work to try to uncover archival materials, things like performance programs that show you the original performance selections that people made when they toured, individual dancers' photo albums, so photo albums that they had in their homes that they would take out to show me when they were talking about their life history. And then also more rare kind of publications that were just bulletins that were never formally published. And so I was able to find these through different sources. Kongfu Ziwang is like this website where people actually sell rare old books online. So sometimes I would buy things off Kongfu Ziwang. But also I would go to a lot of different archives in China and around the world to find these materials. And actually now at the University of Michigan, we have one of the largest collections of archival materials on Chinese dance history anywhere in the world outside China. So we're very proud of that, and we're hoping that that will encourage future research on the topic of Chinese dance as well. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the history of Chinese dance, and so I want to just give a general outline of the narrative of Chinese dance history as I tell it in this book. And this is just a very bullet point understanding, but it gives you the general overview of what I'm talking about in terms of my understanding of where this dance form came from. So firstly, what I realized by looking through the old magazines and newspapers from prior to the establishment of the People's Republic of China, what I realized is that the origins of Chinese dance, it didn't just come about in 1949 with the establishment of the PRC. There was some work being done prior to that. And so I actually find Chinese dance emerging as a specific set of dance works, a repertoire, as well as a concept. The phrase Chinese dance and the idea of Chinese dance really comes about in the 1940s. And this is really interesting because it's actually a product of a lot of intercultural movement that's happening at that time. Both the war against Japan and the Chinese Civil War play a really big role in spurring the creation of Chinese dance. And then the early period of the Chinese Revolution, it also plays a big role in the emergence of this dance form. The second historical point that I think is important is that actually many of the early creators of Chinese dance were coming from really diverse cultural backgrounds. They weren't necessarily what we would think of as sort of the hegemonic center of Chinese culture. So for example, you have important people coming from the diaspora who are born and raised outside China but are of Chinese heritage. You have people who are ethnic minorities living within China. And then you also have artists who are actually just immigrants in China who are of other ethnicities. The other thing that I think is important to note is that Chinese dance, of course, is a field created by men and women, but women play a really prominent leadership role in this field, and that's something that's interesting for me. If you compare Chinese dance to some other artistic fields like literature, music, and theater, many of the famous people that we think of are men, and this leads to the fact that many people writing about modern Chinese culture tend to just think of male figures when they think of the cultural leaders in China. And I think that dance can help us to bring more women into that picture of what we think of when we think of the construction of modern Chinese culture. The third point that I think is really interesting to me and is really important for understanding the history of this art form so just to give you a little context for this, so in the English-speaking scholarly world, I think the Cold War continues to have a really big impact on people's understanding about Chinese culture. And this may be true in Singapore as well, I don't know. But in the United States, when people think of communist China, the last thing they think of is artistic creativity. Usually artistic creativity is sort of they think it's outside the realm of what they think of as communist culture. And so one of the things that I really want to show in this book is that it's actually the early period of the socialist or the leftist movement in China that gives space and also gives a lot of support for the creation of Chinese dance. And so in a way, Chinese dance, it actually flourished in the 1950s and 60s. During the early period of the Maoist Chinese era, this is when the first professional dance companies emerged in China. This is when the first Chinese dance schools were established. And this is when China actually became a national dance form representing China around the world. And interestingly, Chinese dance, also became an important symbol of other Chinese cultural spaces like Taiwan, Hong Kong at the time. But what I'm focusing on here is mainland China, and you see a huge investment and a huge creativity happening around Chinese dance during that earlier period. And this is something that actually goes against a lot of people's existing conceptions of dance practice in socialist China. So many people in the Western world know about ballet because ballets were very popular during the Cultural Revolution. This is when many Westerners first got exposed to Chinese socialist culture because they weren't interacting with China previously. But what I show in this book is that ballet was very important during the very last stage of the Maoist period. But it actually represented a departure from the earlier years. So actually, for a large period of modern Chinese history, artists were actually focusing not on learning dance styles from other countries, such as ballet, but on creating a dance style of their own to represent their own identity. Another important point that I make is that at the end of the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s, Chinese dance was revived, and there's a huge sort of second golden age of Chinese dance that happened in the 1980s. And I actually see those as a direct legacy that came out of the earlier projects that started in the 1950s and 60s, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then the last point, because the book actually does go up all the way until the current moment, till the 2010s, one of the things that I really want to show is that there is continuity in Chinese dance over the many decades that it has existed. And so even in the 21st century, we see people continuing to innovate in this form and continuing to follow some of the key principles that were established when the form was first created. Okay, so now I'm going to go into sort of talking about some of the key artists and dance styles, and I'm going to show a lot of videos as well. So before the 1940s, there were people who laid important foundations for modern Chinese dance in general. One was Yu Rongling, who some people may have heard of. She was the daughter of a Chinese diplomat who worked for the Qing court, and she actually also danced for the Empress Cixi, the last empress of China, in around 1906 or 1907. And she actually had an interesting international career because she actually studied in Paris with Isadora Duncan, who's considered to be the founder of Western modern dance. And so after studying with Isadora Duncan, she also studied dance in Japan. She came back to Beijing and she created some of her own choreographies that she described as Chinese dance, that were created through inspiration from like artwork that she found in the court, in the Qing court, from talking to some of the musicians in the Qing court. And so she developed some early examples. Although they aren't really what we think of as Chinese dance today, they represent an early effort to create this dance form. Mei Lanfang is someone we typically think of as a theater person. He's a very famous Peking opera actor. He was a male actor who specialized in playing female roles. But one of the things that historians and theater scholars now have really emphasized is that Mei Lanfang, together with his collaborator Qi Rushan, who is a theater theorist and director, one of the things that Mei Lanfang really introduced to Chinese Peking opera was the importance of dance. So some of his most important theatrical roles include long dance sequences. So he plays in Ba Wang Bie Ji, he plays the female character where she has a long double sword dance. And so these are dances that he developed that didn't previously exist, and he made dance a really important part of theater. And so in a way, he laid the foundation for Chinese dance just by expanding the role of dance within Xiqu. And then the other person that played a really important role, sort of laying a foundation for Chinese dance, was Wu Xiaobang. In the 1930s, he actually studied in Tokyo, which at the time was a really important center for Western culture in East Asia. And in Tokyo, he was exposed to German expressionist dance, German modern dance, being taught by teachers, Japanese teachers. And he became so inspired that he decided to dedicate his life to promoting modern dance in China. And at the time, he actually used the Japanese term buyo, or in Chinese wuyong, to describe dance for the concert stage. The people that I see as the really important founders of Chinese dance and that I focus on as some of the main protagonists in the story that I tell are these 4 individuals here. So the first one is Dai Ai Lian. She was born in Trinidad, so she's a diasporic Chinese. She was 3rd generation Chinese. She actually grew up completely speaking English, and she didn't speak Chinese until she moved to China when she was in her 20s. But she spent about a decade practicing dance in England, and this is when she started to get inspiration to create a dance style that could represent China, because she wasn't seeing it happening in England. She also faced a lot of racial prejudice, being a dancer of Asian heritage in a largely white setting. And so this all led her to have a desire to start to create her own dance styles that could represent China. So in 1940, she actually moved to Hong Kong, and then from there she moved to Chongqing, and she spent the remainder of her life based in China. So she emigrated to China, and she was really embraced as a leader of the Chinese dance movement, which I think is quite exceptional for someone who was born and raised outside China. Another figure that I look at as a very important early figure in Chinese dance is Kambar Han. She was born in Kashgar in northwest China. She was a Muslim woman of Uyghur ethnicity. She was actually born to an itinerant working class family that had to flee into Central Asia because of just sort of finding work. And so as a child, she actually ended up entering a dance school in Tashkent, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan. And at the time, Tashkent was a very important cultural center in the Soviet Union. It was a place where a lot of artists were thinking about ways to express Central Asian culture in a modern way in the new socialist context of the Soviet Union. And so she spent a decade there studying with famous Uzbek dancer Tamara Kanu. And that's where she became a professional dancer, and she was so good that she was recruited to Moscow. So she spent a year in Moscow. She danced on the most famous dance stages, like the Kremlin, for example. And then after that, this was during the 1940s when China was at war with Japan, and she writes in her autobiography that she always had a strong desire to return to Xinjiang and to return to her homeland. And so during the war, she finally moved back together with her mother, and at the time she had a small daughter. And she moved back to Urumqi, and she began to create her own dance ensemble to teach students and to promote a new style of dance that at the time was actually completely new. So in Xinjiang at the time, it was actually considered very unusual and very shameful for women to dance in public spaces. And she was a pioneer for creating spaces for women to be professional performers in that context. The third person that I focus on is Choi Seung-hee. She's a Korean dancer who actually toured the world between 1938 and 1940. She was the first East Asian dancer to become really famous on the global stage. And she performed a range of dance styles, including ballet, Western modern dance, and her own choreography inspired by local Korean dance sources. And during the war, when Japan occupied large parts of the Chinese eastern coast, Choi Seung-hee actually came to China through her connection to the Japanese government, because at the time, as a Korean woman, she was a colonial citizen of the Japanese Empire. And so she toured in China, and while she was in China, she actually befriended Mei Lanfang, who's pictured here. And they struck up a lifelong artistic friendship in which they exchanged ideas, because at the time Mei Lanfang was very interested, as I said, in developing dance within the context of Chinese theater. And Choi Seung-hee actually had been very successful creating modern Korean dance works. And so they started to collaborate and think about the possibility of creating a modern Chinese dance form. And the last person that I think is a very important early founding figure is Liang Lun. He was actually a student of Wu Xiaobang. He got interested in dance through studying with Wu Xiaobang, the male dancer I mentioned earlier who studied in Japan. Liang Lun is interesting, I think especially here in Singapore, because he was the first person to take early Chinese dance choreographer into Southeast Asia. So he, during the war, he was part of the sort of leftist resistance in Kunming, which was a city occupied by the Nationalist Party at the time. And it became actually too dangerous for he and his other collaborators who had been performing dance in Kunming. Their teacher, Wen Yiduo, who was a famous poet, was actually assassinated because of his political views. And so they fled Kunming. They went to Hong Kong and they started performing, and they put together this group, which included both theater and dance as well as music. It's actually a very famous event in theater history where they toured what was then just the emerging kind of modern leftist performance culture into Chinese areas in Thailand, Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore. And they spent quite a long time here in Singapore until 1948. So these 4 figures are people who I think are really essential for us to understand the early creations and the early ideas of Chinese dance that were forming in the 1940s. And what I think distinguishes what they contributed from some of the earlier people I mentioned, such as Wu Xiaobang, Mei Lanfang, and Yu Rouming, are what I call the 3 core commitments of Chinese dance. And these are commitments that I think continue to inform Chinese dance creation, even to this day. So the first one is the idea of kinesthetic nationalism. And this was the idea that was espoused and promoted by these early figures, that Chinese dance needed to have its own movement form. So at the time, people were experimenting with the idea, for example, of using modern dance to tell Chinese stories. This is something that Wu Xiaobang did, for example, and others. But people who ended up being the early founding figures of Chinese dance felt that that wasn't enough. Actually, they felt that that was like using a foreign language. They wanted to have their own Chinese dance language. And so the form, and what I call the kinesthetic form, right, the movement form, became a locus of creativity and focus for Chinese dance. And that continues to be a really important part of Chinese dance today. So when you go see a performance, a lot of Chinese dance practitioners will say, is this Chinese dance, does it look right, does it have the right form? If it doesn't have the right form, then maybe it's not Chinese dance. And that's a source of debate oftentimes in the dance field. If people move too far away from what they consider to be Chinese dance form, then it can become very controversial. So form is a very important topic within the Chinese dance world in general. And there's a sense that certain forms can represent Chinese culture. The second really important core commitment, which I think is especially important today when we're really interested, I think, in issues of multiculturalism, representation of different marginalized groups. The early creation of Chinese dance was really interested in representing different ethnic groups and different regional differences within the country. And that's why there's so many different styles of Chinese dance that exist today, is that each style was meant to actually represent a different cultural group that made up this diverse nation. And so when we hear the term Zhonghua Minzu, which is a term that's used very widely today that encompasses all the ethnic groups within the Chinese cultural identity, when Chinese dance was being created, that was actually a new concept. So the concept of Zhonghua Minzu, or Minzu, 多种民族国家, a multi-ethnic country, that was being formed at the same time that Chinese dance was coming about. And Chinese dance sort of got behind this new idea of the multi-ethnic modern nation, and it really supported that concept through dance. And then the last point that I've already talked about a little bit, but I want to emphasize, is the idea of dynamic inheritance. So when people talk about Chinese dance, oftentimes, especially scholars, they'll use the term 继承与发展. And what they mean by that, so literally translated, that means inherit and develop. And so they always use these two terms together. And so the idea is that if you are actually going to inherit Chinese dance culture, if you inherit it and don't develop it, that means if you just kind of keep it the way it is, it turns into something static, it turns into something that feels too old-fashioned for people to really enjoy. And so the idea is that you have to inherit it in a dynamic way. So you have to not only inherit it, but develop it, add something new, add something from your own interpretation, and in that way keep it alive. And this allows a space within Chinese dance for individual choreographers to implement their own creative solutions to problems, to express their own experiences, and for those new expressions to sort of be wrapped back into what Chinese dance is, and be legitimated. So an individual choreographer can create a new style that then gets taken in as part of Chinese dance. And so a really good example of that, for example, is Sun Ying, who is a creator in the 1980s who founded the field of Hantang, Chinese classical dance. It's a very specific style of Chinese classical dance. He created it through his own research. It looks totally different from Shenyuan style classical dance. But because it was so successful, people felt that it did actually represent Chinese culture. Now it's seen as a standard style of Chinese dance, and people practice it all over. That's just one example. And so one of the things that I think is really important is for us to not sort of assume that we know what people were doing when they were founding Chinese dance, but actually to look at what they said about what they were doing. How did they describe their own intentions? And so one example of this is a speech that Dai Ailian gave in 1946 when she staged the first really big performance of Chinese dance that happened in Chongqing during the war. And she published this speech that she gave at the time, and it includes this quotation that I think is very interesting. So here's the original Chinese version, but I'll read the English version. So she says, she's sort of reflecting on her own mistakes. She says, for the past 3 years, the Chinese Dance Art Society, which I led in Chongqing, we worked really hard to create Chinese dance dramas. The narrative content was Chinese, the performers were Chinese, yet we cannot say that this was truly Chinese dance drama. We used foreign technique and footwork to tell the story, like using a foreign language to tell a Chinese tale. And this was quite obvious to the audience. We can say that the work of the past 3 years took the first step in establishing Chinese dance as an independent art in China, but as for creating Chinese dance, it was a mistaken direction. I think this quote is really interesting because it introduces this idea of a dance language, but it also helps us to see that at that time, Dai Lian felt like there really wasn't an existing language, but they wanted to create one. So this was something new that needed to be researched, that needed to be developed. The second quote that I want to share is from an interview with Chesson He that was done when she was in China in 1945. And she was actually talking to Mei Lanfang, and this was a conversation between the two artists that was recorded by a journalist. And Mei Lanfang asked Chesson He, what's the role of tradition in your dance choreography? And the way she responded was, I do not completely follow inherited dances that previous people have passed down. Some say new creation is destructive to tradition. I rather believe that new creation has always been the normal development of tradition. In the past, our ancestors' artistic creations were passed down and became today's art traditions. The new creations of today's artists will also become the traditions of future generations. So she saw herself as someone who could create tradition, which is very bold, very ambitious, I think, and also it shows how self-reflexive she was about what she was trying to do. Interestingly, the next sentence here, which I cut out, but it's interesting from our perspective, she's talking to Mei Lanfang. She says, you know, I even think what you're doing on stage, Mei Lanfang, you know, probably someday people will think that's tradition. And that's actually what happened. Like now when we think of Mei Lanfang, we think of him being like the symbol of Chinese theatrical tradition. So she was very forward-looking. So like I said, I really place value on the primary source material, including not only what the dancers said, but also what they performed on stage. And so we can see that by looking at photographs of what Dai Lian was doing in the 1940s. So this is a photograph of her performing a Tibetan-style dance that she collected doing field work in southwest China. But this is actually one of the earliest videos we have of Chinese dance choreography. And to me, it demonstrates the enormous change that took place between Dai Lian's dance style when she was working in England, where she was performing ballet and Western-style modern dance. And then after she moved to China, she really put a lot of emphasis on learning from local practitioners. And so here, we can see a piece of choreography that she actually created based on a segment of Gui opera, or Guangxi local opera that she studied after she came to China. So if you look closely, you can see this is using a folk performance form where there's like a papier-mâché puppet. So she's one person performing in two roles. It's very theatrical. In some places, it's somewhat humorous. It has slapstick elements, and these are all elements that she draws from the theatrical repertoire that she's learning from local practitioners. And so you can see she's using some props also from Chinese theater. So that's a fan in her hand that she'll open up in a few minutes. And so here we can just see an example of her drawing on folk performance to create a stage choreography. And interestingly, this video was actually taken in New York when she was giving a tour to promote her new Chinese dance choreography in the United States to other diasporic Chinese communities. Here we can see an early video of Kambar Han. She was performing what at the time, like I said, was a new innovation. She was adapting local performance practices that she recreated based on her long-time experience that I mentioned, studying in Uzbekistan and in Moscow. And she adapted them into what now we just kind of recognize as traditional Uyghur dance, but at the time this was her own choreography that she was promoting. And from 1947 to 1948, Kambar Han was part of a large ensemble of dancers from Xinjiang in northwest China who actually toured many cities across China. So they went to Nanjing, they went to Shanghai, Beijing, Tianjin, they even went to Taiwan. And this was actually one of the first times that you see large documentation of Uyghur dance in the Chinese language newspapers. You can see that Chinese artists and artists of Han ethnicity in particular were really impressed and interested in the work that she was doing at the time. So it became a really large topic of national conversation in the art world. Like, wow, China has these really diverse dance practices, we should learn from them. The last early video that I want to show is some early clips of Chesing-hee, the Korean dancer I mentioned. She also staged a wide variety of concert dances that were inspired by different types of traditional material. So this is a dance that was inspired by bodhisattva statues. It's called bodhisattva. She has other dances that are based on other religious sculpture. She has dances that are based on shamanic movement, that are based on stories from classical Korean literature. And then this is a later video from her after she moved. She actually moved to North Korea, but she was very influential in creating Korean fan dance as well. So she was one of these figures who was thinking about how to take this wide array of traditional performance practices and use them as inspiration for concert dance performance. This is an essay that Liang Lin published while he was touring in Malaysia in 1947, where he talks about something very similar to what Dai Eilen was talking about. It's called The Need to Make Dance Chinese. And so he gives a similar reflection to Dai Eilen, saying, you know, we really need to create a new dance style that can represent our country. So during the wartime period, there were actually people experimenting with modern Chinese dance choreography in many different parts of the country. So I already mentioned Dai Eilen, Liang Lin, and Kang Bai-han. There's also Jia Zuoguang, who was experimenting with Mongolian theme work, Zhao Dexian, who is an ethnic Korean dancer who was experimenting with modern Korean dance. And it really wasn't until 1949 with the founding of the PRC that a lot of these dancers came together in one place and started to work together as a collective unit and brainstorm how the different experiments that they were doing could actually be put together into a national dance style. And of course, we can't forget that in the communist parts of the country at the time, there was also a really important movement happening that was foregrounding actually the importance of dance specifically as a part of public culture in the new China. So New Yanga was a style of dance that was developed in the communist areas, especially in Yan'an, that was similarly also drawing on folk forms in order to create expressions of new social ideals. And so Yanga was a folk form that was actually used to promote socialism in the early period of the revolution. And so the first production that was staged on stage in the new China using dance as its main performance medium was, interestingly, a dance that was meant to stage the founding of China. So it was meant to stage the revolutionary history through dance. And the dance styles that they chose to use for this production included styles like waist drum, which was from Yanga dance, folk forms drawn from different local folk practices in Han areas in northern China. But then also you can see from the picture on the right that they were actually using some of these early ethnic minority dance styles. You can see here, this is drawing on the Tibetan dance forms that Dai Eilen had staged. This is drawing on the Inner Mongolian dance forms that Jia Zuoguang had staged. And so they brought all these together and saw these as the important language that could be used to have dance convey the story of the nation. But one of the things that happened with this production is that a lot of the critics, when they looked at it, they thought, yes, we can see the power of dance as a medium of expression for our new culture. However, a lot of the dancers themselves are not trained. They're not really fully able to use their bodies as an expressive medium, and they saw this as a big problem because they felt that if you're going to have these huge productions using dance to tell these really important national stories, you need to have professionally trained dancers. But however, because there was no existing conservatories teaching dance, this posed a dilemma and caused people to think about the fact that they needed to create Chinese dance training systems in order to have a really successful dance field in the new country. So for a while, you started to have people experimenting with different dance styles. You had one production created in 1950 that used ballet. Dai Eilen is actually on the right. She was a soloist. And this was a piece about the international peace movement. It was actually inspired by a treaty that a bunch of countries signed against nuclear weapons. So it was called the Peace Dove. And then there was another piece, interestingly, it was called Braving Wind and Waves to Liberate Hainan. It was actually narrating a really recent military victory that had happened on the island of Hainan. And they actually interviewed soldiers to create some of the stories and the scenes for the piece. And that used more of a modern dance vocabulary. But again, people felt like neither of these vocabularies were really sufficient to constitute a new Chinese dance form. And so what happened was they turned to experienced dancers that they knew existed, that they thought could contribute to creating a Chinese dance curriculum. And so one of the dancers they turned to was Kambar Han, the Uyghur dancer who had previously toured around the country. And she actually became the head of the first school specifically designed to train ethnic minority dancers in Chinese dance. And it was located in Xi'an in northwest China. Those are some of her early students. And then they also ended up inviting Che Seung-hee from Korea. And it just happened that this was in 1951 when the Korean War was breaking out. And Che Seung-hee actually already had her own dance school and her own dance company in North Korea at the time. But because of how dangerous it was to be in North Korea during the war, her school had actually been bombed, some of her students had died. And so she accepted the invitation to come to China temporarily to escape the danger. And so while she was in China, she actually became the teacher of the first dance school that recruited students from all over the country to develop Chinese classical dance and Chinese ethnic and folk dance curriculum. So what you can see here is Che Seung-hee working with Chinese dancers in that program, and you can see there's a strong influence from Xi Chu in the curriculum that she taught, and there's other documentation of that program, but many of the really influential Chinese dance practitioners today, like Li Zhengyi is one example. She's considered to be a founder of Chinese classical dance. They were students in that program. Li Zhengyi was a student in that program. Gao Jinrong, who's the founder of the style of Chinese classical dance called Dunhuang dance, was also a student in that program. Sichin Tarha, the Mongolian dancer I mentioned earlier, was a student in that program as well. So it was a very, very influential program. It influenced the way that many practitioners in China went on to then create their own dance curricula later on. So in the 1950s, as many of us know, what's now the Beijing Dance Academy was founded. At the time, it was called the Beijing Dance School. And they taught many different dance styles. So they taught Chinese dance and they taught ballet. And then eventually in 1957, they also set up what they call the Oriental Dance Program that taught Indonesian dance, Indian dance, and other Asian dance styles. But really the core of the dance curriculum that was developed at the Beijing Dance Academy was the Chinese dance curriculum. And it focused heavily on what became known as Chinese classical dance. And this term itself came into being at this time in the mid-50s, which was adapted largely from Chinese traditional theater. But then it also included curricula for ethnic minority dance, specifically Uyghur, Korean, Tibetan, and Mongolian. And then it also had a curriculum for several different regional styles of Han folk dance. So for example, Anhui Huagudeng, Yunnan Huadeng, Dongbei, Yangge, these were regional folk forms that were included in the folk program. And so this became the basic curriculum that actually was used to set up schools of Chinese dance all over the country. So about 300 students were trained in this Chinese dance program during the first 5 years, and they were sent out to actually set up schools and teach all over the country. And so this became the basis for how Chinese dance was taught all over the country after this. One of the interesting things that also happened in the 1950s while these schools were being set up and also new performance ensembles were being set up is that Chinese dance was also being sent around the world. So this was actually a time of a lot of cultural exchange that was happening, particularly with other socialist countries, but also with other countries throughout the post-colonial world. So if we think about the 1950s, this was a time when a lot of countries in Asia and Africa were newly independent. And so there were many countries actually interested in representing their own culture and their own national identity through dance. And so the most important international festival that happened during this period was the dance festival known as the World Festivals of Youth and Students, 世界青年与学生和平友谊联欢节. And China actually sent dancers, you can see the cities on the bottom left here, to all these Eastern European cities to take part in these festivals. And China actually ended up becoming one of the most popular national dance ensembles that would go. So there'd be hundreds of countries being represented at these festivals, but China was, if you look at the early programs and the early sort of writings about these festivals, China was always one of the most anticipated dance groups there. And so many of the early canonical works of Chinese dance were actually sent abroad and won awards at these festivals. And so I went to the archive that holds all of the old materials related to these festivals. It's in Amsterdam. One of the things that I found really interesting was when you look at the festival newspapers that were published for these youth festivals, you see dance everywhere. So these are not dance-specific publications. These are just the newsletters that were given to everyone participating in these festivals. But you can see that dance actually was like everywhere in the visual language of what they were talking about. And so what you can see is that at this time, when different countries were trying to establish international communication and friendship and diplomacy, in the 1950s, this is an early Cold War period when diplomacy was very, very important. They were actually using dance as a medium of exchange, of mutual understanding, and also of building friendship and building sort of mutual ties of peace in a time when people were very afraid of new world wars breaking out. And so dance became a symbol of world peace and also a symbol of sort of promoting a new world for the youth of the future. And so some of the dances that China sent abroad during this time have now become iconic representations of Chinese culture all over the world. So one of these is the Red Silk Dance, which was premiered in 1951, and it became one of the most widely performed dances all over China, but even countries around the world studied this dance form. So for example, the Soviet Union's folk dance ensemble, there's a whole bunch of Russian dancers who came to China performing this dance piece. And this dance was pretty interesting at the time. The people who created it said that they combined Yangge, which is a folk form, and Zhuan, which is considered to be like a low-class, vulgar folk form, with the silk style of silk sleeve or streamer movement that they developed from Chinese theater. And so they melded it together and they created this new dance, which became very popular. Another example of a dance that was toured all over the world at this time to represent China was this dance here, which is, it represented the Tibetan minority in China. And one of the co-choreographers of this piece was actually himself a former folk performer of Tibetan ethnicity. We can see him later in the piece. Let's see. Anyway, his name is Omi Jiacan, and he also stars in the piece. And here's just another example of a type of dance that China was sending abroad in the late 1950s and early 1960s to represent Chinese culture internationally. And this piece is now considered to be sort of an early canonical work of Chinese classical dance. It's based on a famous piece of Chinese music and poetry. And one of the things that's especially interesting to me is that when people in the United States think of, Maoist Chinese culture, they really don't think of this type of image. And so I think it challenges our understanding of Chinese history in general, not just dance history. It challenges us to think of the types of femininity that were being used to represent Chinese culture abroad, but also the different cultural sources like poetry and music that were seen as important cultural resources at the time. So this is just an example of one of the many international touring performances that Chinese dancers went on at this time. So this one, you can see it's in Spanish, and it was from a 1960 tour that went to Latin America. So they went to Colombia, Venezuela, and Cuba. And they performed many of these canonical dance works representing different ethnic minorities and also representing the Han ethnicity too. And I think this is especially interesting for us to think about, that they toured so many countries across the world, and not just sort of the Soviet Union, but places across Asia, Latin America, and Africa. So this is a very important time of international exchange through dance. There's also actually a lot of documentation of the popularization of Chinese dance at this time. So not only were these dances being performed by professionals, but they were also being promoted for practice among amateur dancers and among local dance performing communities around the country. And so you have like this handbook that was published, there were thousands of copies published to teach people how to do the red silk dance, to teach people how to do sword dance, how to do Korean style fan dance. This was a Tibetan style dance called friendship dance. And so on the one hand, this tells us that Chinese dance was being actively popularized. It also tells us that these dances were new. Because if people already knew these dances, if they were already part of the folk culture at the time, they wouldn't need handbooks to tell them how to do them. And so for example, with the red silk dance, if you open the book, you see there's diagrams of how to construct the ribbons and how to attach them to handles and then how to move them into the different patterns. And so this shows that this was a new cultural practice that was being spread all over China and even internationally at the time. Interestingly, I recently just was doing research in the National Library in Singapore, and at this time, these dance handbooks were actually quite sensitive in Singapore, and some of them were being banned because they were considered to be representations of leftist revolutionary culture that could potentially be problematic politically. And so but that also shows us that they were being sent abroad, right? If Singapore had to ban them, that means that China was sending them abroad, hoping that people would learn these new dance forms. And so one of the things that happened at the end of the 1950s that's actually we see being a really important part of Chinese dance creation today is the emergence of the national dance drama, what was then known as the Minzu Wujü. And there are actually quite a few examples of dance dramas with really interesting political themes. So Bao Liandeng featured a female protagonist and was seen as a dance that was promoting free marriage choice and the independent woman, but it was using a mythological classical story to convey that message. Then you have a dance drama that was actually about colonialism, and it was about critiquing the Western imperial presence in China. And then you have another piece that was actually about the role of ethnic minorities in rising up to challenge their marginal status and actually take an active part in the revolutionary process. So Bao Liandeng was a dance that was premiered. It was a full-scale dance drama that was premiered in 1957, and it was actually made into a film. So you can actually go online and watch the entire film today. It gives us a sense of what early Chinese classical dance drama and narrative Chinese classical dance looked like. We can see the really strong impact of Chinese opera theater here, Xiqu and Kunqu in particular. So this was a love story. It was based on a mythological tale that has been told in China since the 12th century. And it retold that story through dance. And the basic conflict of the story is that the female character is an immortal, and she falls in love with a human, but that's considered to be outlawed according to the rules of like heaven and earth. But they defy the rules in order to be together, and so it's a story about choosing your own love and going against whatever the rules are in society. Another full-length dance drama that was made into a film at this time because it was extremely popular is the one I mentioned that was critiquing colonialism. So let's take a look at a few seconds. This is the very beginning of the production. So there's the main villain, and they'll show up close. He's actually portraying an American opium importer who's exploiting the working classes. And so there's an element of class critique here, which you would expect in a socialist dance drama. But there's also an element of racial critique and the critique of the imperial process of being a process in which the white Western countries were oppressing the Asian countries. And that was very much part of the message that they wanted to convey through this performance. This performance also has a really prominent female protagonist who plays a role in leading the revolutionary movement in the overall narrative of the production. And you can see there's a really strong emphasis of theatrical movement here in this production as well. And some people might actually recognize the woman who plays the lead role in this piece. Her name is Shu Qiao. She actually became the leading choreographer in the Hong Kong Chinese Dance Ensemble later in the 1980s. So she went on from being a star performer to actually being one of the leading female choreographers in Chinese dance history. And this is where she got her start as a star. And then the last full-length dance drama from this era that's still recorded on film is the one that focuses on a group of ethnic minorities who rise up against their oppressors, which is, in this case, is represented as the nationalist Han military unit nearby. But this is a really interesting piece. We won't be able to look at it in detail, but it actually explicitly brings together class analysis with ethnic marginalization. And the choreographers were very explicit about that goal. So I think one of the things for me that's interesting is that these pieces, they show that Chinese dance is, it's not only beautiful, it can also be used to deal with really important contemporary social issues and political issues. And that's actually part of the history of the form and where the form comes from over time. So it's interesting to me that Chinese dance isn't often used in that way today, but I think it has the potential to be used to convey political messages. This scene is particularly interesting. I'll show at the very end. So after this confrontation, she and her friend get thrown in a cage. And the sign that they put on the cage, this is the KMT military official, he's the villain. He puts a sign on the cage that says exhibition object and then the name of the ethnic group. And it's written with this radical here that is a demeaning radical implying that they're like animals. And this piece, I think, this scene is very interesting because it's actually critiquing the racism of the Han towards the ethnic minorities and referring to them as exhibition objects that would be put in a cage like animals. So there's a lot of interesting details in these works that we can actually analyze politically in addition to artistically. So the 1960s was a really interesting period of transition in Chinese dance when there was a continuation of this effort to use Chinese dance for political purposes, but also you see a wide expansion of different dance aesthetics that are happening. So this is actually a very famous production, East is Red, that was made in 1964. It was a huge scale production with thousands of performers. It blended music together with dance and choral singing. And it was also a way of staging the national story through performance. So here you see they show there's a huge Western orchestra. In a minute they'll show that on the opposite side there's a Chinese orchestra playing like Chinese instruments. They have this huge choir. But actually the movement styles that they're using are Chinese folk dance, Chinese ethnic dance, all different types of Chinese dance movement choreographies actually make up the majority of the dance scenes in this production. So you have this type of new choreography that happens in the mid-60s. You have this type of choreography, which to me is very interesting. It's actually representing a story taking place in the United States. So this was a piece that was created in solidarity with the civil rights movement. It's actually a scene about police brutality, which is still a very serious problem in the United States. So it shows a white policeman brutalizing a black boy, and then ultimately the boy gets killed, and then there's a response. It's actually a very politically insightful piece. Eventually the police officer is shown to be part of this movement in the United States called the KKK, which is a racist movement. But they use elements of American black dance in the choreography as well. And this is a piece created by a Chinese dance company, a major one, the Zhongzheng Guan, the PLA company in 1964. So in 1964 you have all these different types of revolutionary themes being enacted, not just about Chinese stories, but about international stories of oppressed people around the world. Another thing that you see happening in the mid-1960s is a switch from traditional weapons like swords to modern weapons like guns. But you see this being actually blended together with the Chinese classical dance movement choreography. So if you look at the way they're walking, the way they're holding themselves, the hand motions, they're actually using the Chinese classical dance vocabulary to portray this like really contemporary image of a woman who's taking up arms to defend her nation. So it would have been extremely fresh and experimental at the time that it emerged in the 1960s. So this is all happening. And at the same time, this is when you see the first revolutionary ballets that eventually became really prominent during the Cultural Revolution. So I think this is a part of the story that many people know. During the Cultural Revolution, ballet became prominent. Chinese dance was actually outlawed for the first time in modern Chinese history. And so instead of the dances that were using these new vocabularies of Chinese dance, you see dances that were using the movement vocabulary of ballet. So these were being performed by ballet dancers who were trained in ballet. And they really only used very minimal aspects of Chinese dance in these productions. So today when we look at the history of the Cultural Revolution, one of the things we see is that this was actually a time of destruction of Chinese dance. Many of the leading figures in the Chinese dance movement, like Kang Bar-han and Dai Ailian and Liang Lun, Wu Xiaobang, all these figures were actually attacked and not allowed to perform on stage or take leading roles in the Chinese dance world. So the Cultural Revolution is a time when Chinese dance really wasn't allowed to be staged. And this was a huge departure from actually what had been the whole purpose of the Socialist dance project for the previous 20 years. So at the end of the Cultural Revolution, you do see a huge revival of Chinese dance. And in some ways, this is actually spurred on by the fact that people spent 10 years not being able to create Chinese dance. And so at the end of that period, they were so motivated to actually accomplish what they had wanted to accomplish, but they weren't able to accomplish it. So you have a huge amount of motivation. You have a huge amount of excitement that comes back when dancers come back from, in some cases, jail, in some cases, labor camps. And then they start to recruit a whole new generation of Chinese dance practitioners in the late 1970s. So two of the really influential works that come out during the late 1970s in this period of revival are the peacock princess motif, which becomes a really important part of Chinese dance and continues to be so today. This is a production staged in 1978 and toured Beijing in 1979, starring Yang Liping, who's today like one of the most famous practitioners of Chinese dance in China. At the time, she was only 19 years old. She was a very young dancer. She was cast in the lead role as the peacock princess in this dance drama. The dance drama was based on a folk story from the Dai ethnic minority that's actually also circulated in many countries in Asia and in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So you also have peacock princess stories told in Thailand, for example. And then the production on the right was also staged in Beijing in 1979. It was hugely successful. It was the first full-length dance drama to use the Dunhuang style movement to create an entire story. And it also it gave us this really iconic Fantan Pipa image that comes from the Dunhuang murals in northwest China. And so this production, both of these productions, interestingly, were created not in major urban areas. They were created in pretty far away from the coast parts of China. So this was created in Lanzhou, which is in northwest China. The Peacock Princess production was created in Xishuangbanna, which is in the far southwest. But it shows that Chinese dance has sort of already reached such broad popularity prior to the Cultural Revolution that in the few years just following the end of the Cultural Revolution, these relatively marginal places had enough resources of trained Chinese dance choreographers and dancers to be able to stage these really successful large-scale works in the immediate years following the Cultural Revolution. So this is, as I said, a piece that was inspired by the imagery in the Dunhuang Buddhist cave paintings that are found in northwest China. They're about 1,000 years old, and they served again as the research inspiration for this new movement vocabulary that was introduced in this piece. One of the things that I argue is that it was building out of the earlier period of Chinese dance experimentation in the 1950s. So we actually see a precursor to the Dunhuang style dance created in 1955 by Dai Ailian. This was a duet called Fei Tian Apsaras, which it used one of the iconic pieces of imagery of the flying celestial in the Buddhist paintings to create a dance form with the long silk sleeves, and that reappears later in the Dunhuang dance works. Let's look at a short video of Yang Liping's peacock dance. So this is also an extremely influential dance piece that she staged as a solo in 1986 for the first time, and it's gone through many revisions. This is a slightly later version. But in this piece, we see her using the image of the peacock princess in a very new kind of movement vocabulary. So she actually uses her hands and her fingers to create the sense of fluttering wings. Sometimes she creates the peacock head with her hands, but she also uses some movement of Dai dance that had already been canonized in the earlier period. But of course she develops on it. This is a really good example of the dynamic inheritance that I mentioned earlier, where a dancer can develop sort of her own voice within an existing dance style and then become an iconic figure of that dance style. So if we look at the earlier history of the peacock dance, we can also see that peacock dance had started to become staged in the earlier 1950s and 60s. People started researching a minority folk form that was called the peacock dance that looked something like this in the 1950s. In 1957, the Xishuangbanna ensemble staged the first longer production. It was about a half-an-hour production of the Peacock Princess story. But then also there was this children's film that came out in 1963 that staged the Peacock Princess story using animation puppetry. But it has these really interesting dance scenes in the film that give us a sense that this peacock dance image was actually something that artists were working with during the earlier 1960s as well. That I think Yang Liping and the other choreographers from Xishuangbanna were probably involved with creating this choreography and then brought it back later in the later version of the peacock dance. But so we can see that these images are circulating in many different artistic forms, and dance is part of this larger conversation of Chinese cultural creation that happens at each different stage. So peacock dance and Dunhuang dance are both really still very popular styles of Chinese dance today. So Silu Huayu, the dance drama that I mentioned earlier that premiered in 1979, was recently revived in 2009 and toured across China and around the world. It went to the United States, it went to a bunch of other countries. And Yang Liping has continued to create new versions of peacock-themed dances that continue to sell out to huge audiences all over the world. So we can see that Chinese dance, it brings in these new styles of dance at different times, but then those styles become incorporated and they become canonical over time as they become successful and people embrace them as symbolic of what they interpret as some aspect of Chinese cultural heritage. So I'm almost at the end of the talk, and I hope we still have time for a question and answer at the end. I think we should have a bit of time, and I'd really like to hear from all of you. But I just want to show a little bit of sort of contemporary examples of Chinese dance choreographers who are inheriting the legacies that came from the earlier dancers, but also doing new things with them. So I don't know how many people watch the television show 中国好舞蹈, the Chinese dance competition show. So we know that there's a lot of Chinese dancers who actually are very successful in this format of television dance. And so one example of a very successful practitioner of Chinese dance in this venue is Li Mina, a dancer of Uyghur ethnicity from Xinjiang. She ended up becoming the winner on one of the earlier Chinese television competitions, I think in 2014. And here she is performing in the televised competition. She's doing an Uzbek themed dance here. But if we look at sort of where she comes from and her dance training and background, we can see that she's a direct descendant or inheritor of Kangbar Han style. So Li Mina actually trained at the Xinjiang Arts Institute, which was an institute where Kangbar Han served as the first dean, the first chair of dance, and the creator of many of the dance curricula that are still used at the school today. And they actually have 2 statues of her on campus. They commemorate Kangbar Han as a founding figure of their school and of the dance style that they teach, and they're very proud that she's one of the early founding figures of the school. And so Li Mina is actually a student of Kangbar Han and carrying on that legacy, but of course she's doing new things with it. The way that she was just dancing on that video looks a bit different from the way that Kangbar Han was dancing in the 1947 video, right? And so that's part of the expectation, is that each new generation will expand the form and make it relevant to a new set of audiences. We also have the continued experimentation with Chinese folk dance, or ethnic Han folk dance at the Beijing Dance Academy. So this is a production staged in 2004, 大地之舞, that was produced by the 中国民族民间舞系. And it was a long 晚会 or gala that incorporated many different regional dance forms representing Han groups of different regions, different ethnic minority groups, very similar to the way that Dai Ailian initially envisioned Chinese dance. And they actually talked about her in the program, saying that we were taking inspiration from what our predecessors had done. And you can see here that they were actually using the Yanga aesthetic, the new Yanga aesthetic, to also pay homage to their history of revolutionary dance as sort of the core of where they came from. Another interesting phenomenon that we see today in China is the creation of large-scale Chinese dance dramas with really clear connections to contemporary politics. So this piece here, Bihai Silu, is one of a series of large-scale dance dramas that are created around the Yidai Yilu political international project that's being promoted in contemporary China today. And so in a way we can see that Chinese dance, in China at least, continues to be connected oftentimes to new contemporary political events, also to international diplomacy. So this piece was actually sent to Sri Lanka, and it actually staged the interaction between a Chinese character and a Sri Lankan character at a time when China was building a port in Sri Lanka, so it's very connected to economic issues as well. But at the same time, it's an important artistic medium that's being performed for really large audiences, and it has a huge following. I actually saw a performance of this piece in Beijing at the Guojia Daijuyuan, which is a huge theater with thousands of seats. It was totally full. Tons of people were there, people from all different walks of life, different ages, and so it showed me that Chinese dance today in China has a popular following in addition to being popular among only people who are professional dancers or specialists in dance. And this is something that I think even in the United States a lot of large-scale dance productions have trouble achieving. So the fact that Chinese dance has a really large popular audience, I think shows us that there's potential for dance to actually reach mainstream audiences in the same way that like Broadway musicals do, for example. So the last choreographer that I talk about in my book is Zhang Yunfeng, who is a practitioner of Chinese classical dance who actually experiments with a lot of new content and new approaches to Chinese classical dance choreography. So in 2002, one of his really influential, well-known solo dances was called Yanzhiko. And this piece is inspired by a film and a novel that were actually first created in Hong Kong. And so to me that's interesting that Chinese dance is embracing stories, literary works that are created outside of mainland China. But of course this was after Hong Kong was returned to China, but it's still a relatively new phenomenon that it was based on a novel that was written in the 1990s. So to have such a work of recent contemporary literature inspire Chinese classical dance production, I think showed that he was trying to experiment with new content. And interestingly, this piece actually is about, if you know the story of Yanzhiko is about, it time travels, and it's also about a piece about nostalgia, and it's a piece about disappointment as well. So in a way, many of the dance critics who've analyzed this piece have talked about how it stages this relationship to the past that is somewhat problematic. So it's a relationship to the past that is very nostalgic, but it also recognizes that we don't necessarily ultimately find the idealized past that we're looking for. So the end of the piece is particularly haunting. The main character turns into what looks like sort of a lifeless body at the very end. And this was actually quite controversial as well when it was first staged. Some people said, we shouldn't have an image like this representing Chinese culture. It's gruesome. It looks like a headless person. How can this represent China? And so you have this debate, right? But ultimately, this is now considered to be a very canonical work of Chinese classical dance. So it shows that you can push the boundaries in content, in style, and also in sort of what's acceptable to represent the Chinese cultural identity through dance. It's a very haunting piece. And I personally find it to be a really interesting example of experimental Chinese classical dance choreography. And I'll just show one other example that Zhang Yunfeng was also a part of. This was a work that was staged in 2013. So I think that in particular a theme that runs through his work is a confrontation with the struggle of being a contemporary person that's trying to have a relationship with history. And so what we see here staged at the very beginning of this piece is a modern Chinese painter, Zhang Daimian, who is a real person who in the 1930s went into the Dunhuang caves and painted the images. He was one of the first people to paint the individual images and then give exhibitions so that people could see what was in the caves. But what you can see here is standing right behind him is a dancer who you'll see up close in a minute, who looks like a Tang Dynasty dancer. And so what he's actually staging here is an interaction or a confrontation between this modern individual and this historical figure in the painting. So I think this is interesting here. It looks sort of like he's moving her. Maybe he's inventing her. Maybe she's a figment of his imagination. But they're having this kind of relationship, this intersubjective relationship. And this is what starts the piece. And so I see this piece as actually not a staging of Chinese tradition, which it is, but a staging of this complex relationship between a modern individual and this imagined past that's supposed to represent Chinese imperial culture. And it goes in and out of these kind of dreamlike images. The music that it uses is somewhat unconventional for Chinese dance. The stage set is quite austere, which is a bit different from a lot of Chinese dance productions. But again, this was actually a piece that was a bit controversial in the Chinese dance community, but ultimately most people today think that it's actually a very successful example of experimental creative projects that are happening in the Chinese dance world. Okay, so that's all I have for you today. And I hope we can have some time for question and answer now. Thank you so much for listening.